I don't want to keep you. You arrived punctually, so let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about the neuroscience behind a novel eye movement protocol. This protocol is actually one part of a larger treatment called release. But in the presentation today, we're going to be just talking about the eye movement protocol and also a calming exercise that we teach as part of release. We're also going to cover the results of a pilot study that was done on the eye movement portion and a couple of the calming exercises that we use. By way of introduction, my name is Deanna Cronus. I am a licensed professional counselor in Illinois, and I'm just beginning the process to become licensed in Florida. I have a Master of Arts in Clinical Mental Health Counseling from Northwestern University, where I graduated summa cum. Hopefully there's some Northwestern people here I'd love to chat and catch up. I'm also trained in EMDR and also hypnosis. And you may have noticed recently there's a bit of a move to sort of change and rebrand, if you will, hypnosis. Dr. Andrew Huberman is really kind of spearheading that whole movement to refer to it more as non-sleep deep rest. I'm also the person who came up with release, which we will reference a bit here. Gina Martin, Dr. Gina Martin, has her PhD from the University of Iowa. She teaches at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. She wasn't able to join us. She's an LPC in Illinois and Wisconsin, and she is our PI for our studies on release. So we will be presenting, as I said, the pilot study, the exploratory study into release, the results. We received word a few weeks back that we would also be getting, and we did get actually two new grants to study release a second time. We actually got 12 times as much money in these grants than in the first, based on these results that I'm about to share. Gina also attended Northwestern. We met at Northwestern. And so I believe Melissa already put all the sign-up sheets. I just wanted to make note, we've probably been doing this for a few days, so you know, but there is a sign-in sheet that's more important for you. That's to sign up to get credit for coming to this presentation. But we do have sign-up sheets if you're interested in receiving this PowerPoint, and if you also want to receive information about release trainings in the future. So today what we're going to be talking about is the neuroscience of the eye. People don't think about the eye that way, but it's really truly relevant, as you will see. We'll talk a little bit about basic natural eye movements that occur and how helpful they are to counselors, because abnormalities in these eye movements actually indicate specific mental disorders. Super fascinating. We're going to present a theory that I came up with. I wrote a paper with a gentleman named Dr. Eric Beeson from Northwestern and with Gina Martin, our principal investigator. And in the course of doing this paper, it was called The Eyes and Emotion Regulation. And a bit of that content is here. But I was talking to Dr. Beeson and I told him this theory that I have, upon which I based release. And he said, oh, that sounds like the eye map, an eye map of emotions. And so he coined that term, so I wanted to thank him publicly because he's amazing. We're going to talk about emotion suppression. Ultimately, that really is what we are talking about today, because we're going to utilize the eye and eye movements to help our clients unsuppress, if you will, emotions that they have not repressed so much as suppressed. And we'll talk about that and the connection to mental disorders. We will, of course, talk about the theoretical justification and protocol of both the experiment specifically, and also just sort of briefly compare it to release as a whole. We want to tell you the results of that pilot study, which was, as I said, exploratory in nature, and talk just a little bit about the new study. Okay, so just to get us started and to sort of contextualize things, here's just a little bit about what release as a whole is. And we're going to be framing this always, everything we do in release is pretty much framed in the context of the window of tolerance. I also want to make just a brief disclosure, which I'll do after I give you this context. Hi. So release is broken down into 3 parts. The first part is made up of calming exercises. You can sort of think of the 3 parts of the polyvagal window of tolerance. This is kind of what I do with clients, that we want to be inside the window of tolerance, and I'll go into that in more detail. But the calming exercises, those are used when people are up above the window of tolerance, when we want to lower them, deactivate them a bit. So that's the first part of release. Not super novel, nothing super novel there. The other part of release, conversely, you could think of as being at the opposite end, right? So this is when our clients are below the window of tolerance, when they're in freeze, shutdown, depression. I love to say numbing out because people don't always think of numbing out when they think of being in freeze or dorsal vagal, polysympathetic. Am I saying that right? Parasympathetic poly is a friend of mine, I guess. I must have just invented her. So that has to do with emotion suppression. So as I said, when somebody's up above and they're activated, we want to calm them down and try to bring them into the window of tolerance. But when they're down in freeze, we use activating exercises. For our purposes today, that's what's important, because we're going to be, this includes eye lifts and a somatic release step, which I think you'll find fascinating. The bulk of this presentation is about eye lifts, and we'll talk about what those are. There's a third part of release which we won't touch on today. Ultimately, the best way to describe it is to say that it mimics, it's meant to mimic the inside, the window of tolerance. And as I said, we're not going to talk about that. Kind of scroll in here. Oh, I fixed this. Oh, that. Okay, so let's jump into the really interesting, I think, part about all this. Let's talk about the neuroscience of the eye, and then cover some basic natural eye movements. I'm not sure how many of you in the room knew this. Perhaps you are aware from reading the presentation brochure, or perhaps you knew it on your own. But the retina, the curved portion of the back of the eye, is entirely made of brain tissue. I think that's an absolutely fascinating fact. That means that every single cell that makes up the retina is actually a neuron. The eyes themselves actually are pressed out of the brain in the first trimester of pregnancy. The eyes later reconnect to the brain via the optic nerves, which are also entirely made of brain tissue. In point of fact, the eyes, the retina at least, and the optic nerve are part of the central nervous system, in addition to the brain and of course the spinal cord. And I think that's an interesting fact, if you did not know it. And it's certainly important to our discussion. What really is essential to understanding everything we're going to be talking about today is to know that there are, and this is one of the many words you see in the literature, countless connections between the retinas and structures throughout the entire brain. Very important fact for the purposes of our discussion. These connections, of course, are visual, and that takes place in 2 ways. We all know that. Through central eyesight, which is what most of us think of when we think of the eyes, but also a visual portion that has nothing to do with central eyesight so much as orientation of the body, like helping to stabilize us in the world. More recently discovered were connections, literal connections, between the retinas and structures throughout the brain that have nothing to do with vision. These were literally discovered about 20 years ago, right around the turn of the present century. So we're all familiar with the rods and cones of vision. These work through cells or neurons on the retina called retinal ganglion cells, RGCs. What was discovered at the turn of the century approximately was a form of retinal ganglion cells known as intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, or iPRGCs. We didn't know about them before. They have nothing to do with vision, but they are triggered by light. These cells are activated because they contain a pigment which is called melanopsin. So sometimes in the literature, you will see them referred to as melanopsin cells. IPRGCs, same thing as melanopsin cells. So let's go a little deeper, or get a little more specific, I guess I should say. We're not just talking about structures throughout the brain, but really specifically in the limbic system. Countless structures within the limbic system are connected to our retinas, literally, through these IPRGCs, or melanopsin cells. Again, they're light-mediated, they're triggered by light, which is why eye movements are such an interesting thing that we'll get into more specifically. Again, as I said, these are non-visual connections. Really importantly, they are direct connections. Sometimes they have secondary, they have stops along the way, but most of these connections are direct. What do I mean by that? That means, so here's the retina, the curved structure in the back of the eye. Most of our melanopsin cells, or our IPRGCs, are at the bottom of the retina, which you wouldn't be surprised to hear because the sun is in the sky, correct? So that's where it'll hit and activate. But they aren't all there, which is why eye movements are so fascinating. When one of these IPRGCs, bless you, is triggered by light, by the photopigment inside the neuron, it's activated and it sends an axon out to one of these countless connections in the limbic system or elsewhere, but we're talking about the limbic system. And it's one axon reaches all the way to that specific structure. So whether we're talking about the suprachiasmatic nucleus, as we see here when we talk about the circadian clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the limbic system sits above the roof of our mouth. And it is, basically we have time clocks or circadian clocks in every single neuron in our body. All of them are controlled by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is controlled by a cell on the retina. Very interesting. Other systems in the limbic system that are relevant for our discussion today that are controlled by these IPRGCs, these non-visual cells in the eye, are our arousal system and mood. For instance, with mood, the thalamus and the amygdala are both regulated by these systems, these direct connections. And this is true even in people who are unsighted. So you can see it's not vision dependent. Some of our, well, we have 4 natural eye movements. The first is saccades. Saccades are those eye movements that occur, I don't know if you can all see me well enough, but like when you just move your eyes in a different direction. That's a saccade. It can be voluntary, you can choose to do it, or maybe something will happen suddenly and your eyes will go in that direction, involuntary. There's also something called smooth pursuit eye movements. Smooth pursuit eye movements occur when we watch a bird fly across the sky. That one is considered to be a voluntary eye movement. You can choose to watch that bird or not. An important eye movement that occurs naturally, as I said, these are all 4 are natural, for our discussion is something called vergence. Vergence is basically focus or depth perception. And we're going to talk about that and talk about an exercise that utilizes a manipulation of focus to specifically calm people. And the 4th is called the vestibular ocular eye movement. That accounts for managing the steadiness of our vision when we move our head. So the eye moves a bit to account for movements. I won't dance or anything because that was going to just frighten everybody, but to account for that movement. Oh, something I wanted to mention, I don't have it cited here, but if you were to refer to a paper, the paper that I referenced earlier, it's called The Eyes and Emotion Regulation, Helpful Tips for Counselors. We have a whole section there about what abnormalities that occur within these 4 types of natural eye movements indicate which mental disorder. And it can actually be diagnostic. It can help you differentiate. Eye movements can help us diagnose unipolar and bipolar depression. and abnormalities, I should say abnormalities, and abnormalities in saccades specifically. We don't have tons of time to talk about that, but can help differentiate between unipolar and bipolar depression. So more information in that article if that interests you.
What was the article?
Oh, sure. It's called The Eyes and Emotion Regulation, Helpful Tips for Counselors. It's my last name is the, I believe. Thank you. So let's talk about that new theory that I referenced. Oh, Tina Fey. So we're all familiar. We're going to kind of cover this as like the basis for our conversation. We're all familiar with when somebody rolls their eyes. We've probably all done it, right? The research tells us that when somebody rolls their eyes, they're indicating anger or disgust. A famous example, of course, is the very, very sad, unfortunate story at the Academy Awards. But I like to mention it because I think we've all probably seen it or heard about it. So when Chris Rock tells that joke that he shouldn't have told, he deserved what he got, but he told a terrible joke. If you look at the footage of Jada Pinkett Smith, I'll try to get my huge hair out of the way, she literally goes like this. She stays there for a bit. What she was ultimately communicating to her husband was that she was angry. Probably other emotions as well, but she was certainly angry. And that's what happens, right? Our eye movements, we're all familiar with the downward gaze of sadness. That tells others around us how we are feeling, what emotion we're having. And as we talked about, oh, no, I didn't talk about it, so I'll talk about it here. These connections, when I talked about the axon going directly to whether it's the suprachiasmatic nucleus or the thalamus or the amygdala, it triggers a neuron at that resulting structure. And in response, that structure sends its own arm out, its own axon back. So this communication between retina and structures within the limbic system and throughout the brain is two-way. It's actually a round trip and very important to our discussion. Glad I have it here. So what I theorized was if we can have an emotion occurring structurally in our brain, and it can communicate neuronally to the retina, and the retina can take a certain eye position, and that eye position can communicate to the people around us that we're having a certain emotion, why couldn't it happen in reverse? In other words, if an eye roll indicates anger, and you have a client who is suppressing anger to their detriment, why couldn't they lift their eyes up to access anger? So digging into the research, I found that they in fact could. And that's what we're going to talk about. So this is the eye map of emotions, such as it is. I am not an artist. Well, let's start talking about EMDR, the lateralized or side-to-side eye movements of EMDR. We know from research that those eye movements suppress a part of the amygdala called the Threat Assessment Center of the amygdala. They also suppress fear. What I sort of hypothesized in chatting with Dr. Leeson is that perhaps in prehistoric times, ancient times, humans would scan the horizon. Their eyes would go back and forth as most of the threat came on ground way back when, as we evolved. And when they found nothing to be fearful of, they felt they could feel a sense of trust. So I just hypothesized that lateralized eye movements could be just associated with the emotions of trust or mistrust. Now let's look at what happens neurobiologically when somebody lifts their eyes up. When you lift your eyes up, and we will go into this, this is what you're here for, you activate a part of the brain called the locus ceruleus. And we're going to talk about that in a lot of detail. But for right now, let's just state, again, for context, what happens when the locus ceruleus is activated. It releases norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is the same thing as noradrenaline. Norepinephrine is the brain's version of epinephrine. So the body has epinephrine / adrenaline, same thing. The brain's version is noradrenaline, norepinephrine. When it releases, it's a really interesting part of the brain. When it releases norepinephrine, it douses almost every single part of the brain in norepinephrine, which is activating. I know you're going to wonder why we're activating people as counselors, but we'll get there. When it activates them, when it reaches all these parts, literally only 2 or 3 parts of the brain, it does something else. It activates rather than suppresses, as we talked about here with the lateralized movements of EMDR. It activates a part of the amygdala called the emotional memory center, or part of the amygdala. And as I said, it also activates people, their entire sympathetic nervous system. But before we go further, let's kind of say, why are we talking about this? Why is it important? Well, because of emotion suppression. We know what it is, just wanted to define it here for our purposes. It's just that attempt to avoid difficult, painful feelings. As opposed to repression, this is when somebody kind of knows, oh, I have this terrible feeling, I don't like it. Let me sit on the couch and watch television for 6 hours so that I can avoid it, or whatever they should choose to. ES, emotion suppression, plays a role in depressive disorders, anxious disorders, trauma disorders, eating disorders, OCD, pretty much anything almost that you can think of, and hence this conversation, and hence release as a treatment. Freud's definition of depression, Northwestern teaches psychodynamic, that's how I practice, so of course I've got to at least touch on Freud a little bit. I'm not going to make a joke, I was going to make that joke. Depression, Freud said, is anger turned inward. I believe that completely. And release is very much based on that premise. We'll get there. But as I said, feeling angry, feeling certain emotions can be difficult, so people suppress them. There's another reason they suppress difficult emotions. I don't really have it cited here per se, but I think we're all familiar with the fact that many, if not most, if not all, most mental disorders are rooted in adverse childhood experiences. Certainly not all, but most, many. Now, when we're children, and no matter almost what we're dealing, we have what is called the adaptive child brain. We know somehow as children that almost no matter what is going on in that household, we're better off in that house than on the street. And so when we suppress our emotions as we need to, because we don't want to tick off our caregiver, it's healthy, it's adaptive. When we carry this into adulthood, and we are actually at that point able to take care of ourselves, it's no longer healthy and adaptive. And that's, I think, what a lot of us, certainly I, work with. But something else also happens when we're living through adverse childhood experiences. We internalize negative self-beliefs. Something is wrong, we know it, but we don't really want to consciously think too much that something is wrong with our current caregiver, whoever that might be. So, oh my gosh, it must be us. As I said, in release and in this study that we're going to talk about, we focused on suppressed anger specifically, and I'll explain why that is. Just a brief heads up, resistance or defense mechanisms towards anger are huge, and we will talk about them today, but I just kind of wanted to give that piece of information, that the overarching, I would say, piece of information will be that I like to call it a both and. I mean, I didn't create that, but so basically that you can say to your client, yes, they did take care of you. Yes, they did love you, or he or she or they, whomever. And you can be angry. You can feel the emotion of anger about the way their treatment of you is still impacting you. That's really important to understand going forward. So let's talk about the neuroscience of ILIF specifically. This is the good book. So the locus ceruleus, that's Latin for blue spot. It is actually blue in color. It's very small, and it's buried very deeply inside the brainstem. So way back, that most ancient part of the brain. Hard to get to. It's been studied for about 60 years with great difficulty. In the last 10, they've had a little bit more luck studying it because of fMRIs. The LCNE system, as it's referred to, locus coeruleus / norepinephrine system, well, the LC is the main producer of norepinephrine. As I said, that's the brain's version of epinephrine or adrenaline. And as I already said, it reaches most of the brain and the spinal cord. But it helps to manage activation, behavior, and aspects of our sensory life, if you will. Importantly, norepinephrine has antidepressant properties. Further, malfunctions within the LCNE system are linked to depression and other mental disorders. Transcutaneous stimulation, which is a TENS, like a TENS machine, if you've seen those, which stimulates the vagus nerve, do lessen depressive symptoms and cognitive issues. That's already been demonstrated. And one of my favorite researchers, sleep researchers, her name is Gina Poe. She has been cited, and others have been cited, saying that the LCNE system should be studied further for treating mental health issues. And that's what we're doing here. As I said, it sets off a sympathetic response, and perhaps most importantly, but I think it's worth repeating, the LCNE system activates the emotional memory center of the amygdala, our deepest feelings about trauma. It's activating, and we've already sort of compared it to EMDR. So what does the research say? How do we use the eyes to activate the LCNE? By lifting them up for at least 15 seconds. I prefer 30 and release. The chin can go up slightly. I don't like it to go up too high. Why do we do that? What is our experimental protocol? Let's compare it just lightly, just briefly, to release. And again, I maybe didn't say this. This session, this presentation, isn't meant to be a training. We do have a complete training in release in the eyelips and the rest of release. Just saying, maybe not enough just in this hour or so to utilize this with clients. So what we do in release and what we did in the experiment is we tried to either move clients up or down. I put a star. This is like, I think, our first actual look at the window of tolerance. But I'm sure we're all familiar. When our clients are activated up, they're maybe experiencing some anxiety or rage. That's fight or flight or sympathetic. When they're deactivated, they're perhaps down in depression, freeze, they're shut down, and emotional avoidance is another term that we want to focus on. This is dorsal vagal parasympathetic, shame, low self-esteem, numbing out, basically all synonyms. But we focused in our research study on depression. In our new study, we're going to study more than just depression. But in the pilot study, we just looked at depression. And let's take a look at how we did that. So just a basic comparison of the experiment versus the full treatment. As I said, we focused down below, down here, on deactivation, on freeze. And we just came up with some nomenclature. When we do the exercises for people to calm them down when they're up in fight or flight, we just call that peace release. It's kind of a fun name. And then when they're down here in freeze, we use specific exercises that we'll talk about, including the eyelifts, which are meant to be activating, and we'll talk about why. And that is called emotion release, because that's what we're trying to do, of course, is get their emotions to be experienced and for them to understand that preferably they can feel their feelings within that window of tolerance rather than getting activated up or deactivated down. We also have as a goal for release to widen that window of tolerance, right? So we want people to be able to feel their feelings organically in the moment, not necessarily requiring treatment. That's the goal, is to help them live their lives. I often call release just a new way of being in the world, because many of these exercises they can do themselves, not all of them. So what we cover today, as I said, is peace release. In release, we have multiple exercises for calming. The experiment looked at 2. Today we'll look at 1. And then emotion release, which consists of eyelifts and somatic release. The calming eye exercise that we used in this study is certainly not proprietary to release. You might know, I mentioned Dr. Andrew Huberman. He was literally just written about, I think this week in Time magazine, I believe it was. He's just doing amazing things, trying to get the word out about science. If you don't know him, you should probably follow him. But he shares an exercise that we used. Frankly, I learned this exercise in a hypnosis training a number of years ago in New York City, but it's the same thing. Huberman calls it panoramic vision. I was taught a version called, same thing, it's called peripheral vision. So what is the science around this? When we are anxious, we go into tunnel vision. We can literally, sometimes without realizing it, narrow our field of vision, lock in to a particular depth. But there is a way to overcome this. Sometimes we call them biohacks. I don't like that term. I forgot the term I sometimes use, biomechanics or something. But what is done is instead of locking in, we want to widen our vision. But let's talk about the science behind that. Why would we do that? Well, there is an actual connection between the muscles in our eyes that control focus and the autonomic nervous system. So when, let's say for instance, I like to give the tiger example. If a tiger walked in here, I pretty much guarantee every person's eyes would focus on that tiger. And when your eyes lock in on a particular depth, the muscles that control vergence or focus tell your ANS to go into fight or flight. There's something here to focus on. It's a threat. Pump the blood to the arms in case we have to fight it. Pump the blood to the legs in case we have to run. Make the heart beat faster and shut down digestion because we do not have time to go to the bathroom. So a way to override this is to unfocus your vision. So if you and frankly, it doesn't take a tiger. You can stare at your computer for too long and kind of go into this mode of being in sympathetic mode, basically. You can unfocus your vision, just widen your field of vision. Not everyone can do this, but most clients can. Notice that you can see something at the periphery without moving your eyes, and that unfocuses your vision. The muscles in your eyes tell your ANS to go into parasympathetic rest and digest mode, and that calms us. It's a very cool exercise. If we had more time, I'd walk you through what I do with clients, but we'll see. Okay, so the eyelids themselves, they involve eye strain, but not pain. The chin can go up, but I like to say only slightly, because I've seen clients do it so much that I feel like the chin goes up so much that the eyes aren't really straining. So that's why I like to say that. For our study and for release, we have them held, those eyelids, for about 30 seconds. Clinician timed them. It had to be at least 15 to activate the locus coeruleus, although I would like to explore that further myself. We had the client think of, or the subject in the case of the experiment, think of what we call the focal incident for those 30 seconds. That's all they had to do. It's kind of nice because I don't know about you, if any of you are trained in EMDR, but sometimes people are like, I'm supposed to think and move my eyes and they want me to breathe, and so there's a few things to think about, and not everybody complains about that, but occasionally people do. So we try to keep it simpler. There are specific questions the clinician asked after the eye lift, and I put this here and I'll put this everywhere, and maybe I'll get a tattoo that says, remember defense mechanisms, because they are real. We also have a somatic release component. We know exercise is a good complement to therapy for depression. Of course, the study was about depression, but exercise is a good complement to therapy for many things. And that even small amounts of movement can lessen depressive symptoms and improve learning. So we just have clients, we had our subjects decide ahead of time on a position to use to help deepen that LCNE activation. How much LC do we want? How much NE, norepinephrine, do we want? What happens when people are feeling or experiencing a different amount of norepinephrine? Well, a small amount is what you hear if something were to, a loud noise were to take place. You would be able to switch your attention and very quickly learn whether you needed to address it or not. We call them tonic levels during the day, like right now, unless I'm boring the hell out of you. You hopefully have tonic levels of norepinephrine, and this helps things like learning and memory, being awake, attention, and actually other complex functions. Too much norepinephrine does result in panic. We have not seen this happen. I've not seen it happen anecdotally. We didn't see it happen in the study. Perhaps it could at some point, but we have not seen it. A really interesting part of the LCME system is that it is supposed to shut off during REM sleep. And it does, unless a person has PTSD. Then it doesn't. And that's actually problematic. And hopefully we'll get to talk about that a little bit. So what was our experimental protocol? We had to have our clinicians, our participating clinicians, have a case conceptualization already in place. They had to already have an understanding, I don't know how many of you are psychodynamic, but hopefully this resonates, that they should feel anger toward a caregiver, but did not. They might have been angry to everybody else in the world, and we'll talk about anger more, but they do not feel anger, or if they do, if you explore it with them more deeply, you'll quickly see it turn to tears or something else. We went through informed consent. The pre-treatment assessment was the BDI and the PANIS. We'll talk about that. We had held a planning session, at least one, a treatment session, a debrief session. We repeated that planning, treatment, debrief, and then we had them take another assessment. The planning session, am I good on time?
Yeah.
Okay. We talk about something called a focal person. That's a caregiver who maybe was involved in some kind of adverse childhood experience that they perhaps should feel angry with, but do not. The root emotion for the purpose of the experiment and for release overall is anger. Is that focal? We pick a focal incident, like something traumatic that happened to focus on. You can start small and work bigger. You can work back to the past. But whatever focal incident you pick, it should be something that's still having a deleterious effect on the client. There's a reason for them to be angry, right? We don't want people to live in anger. That's not what release or the experiment were about. But if it's still impacting them, if they're still repeating patterns and picking maybe the wrong partner or getting into certain situations that are harmful to them, then they have a reason to feel angry. We do something called we choose something together with the client called the incorrect self-perception. You might think it's more for trauma, but it's actually useful for everything, as ACEs play such a part in everything. My friend Melissa contributed the part of the preferred self-perception. I was calling it correct self-perception, and she said, well, they don't think it's correct yet, so maybe we should call it preferred, which I'm super grateful for. And then, as I said, we pick out a somatic release position. They're going to clench their thighs, or maybe their glutes or their arms, or they'll stretch or something. And they can change it at the last minute. It doesn't matter at all. During the planning session, we made sure to teach them that panoramic vision or peripheral vision exercise. We also did a really cool mini mindfulness exercise that we use in release. And then we showed them how to do the eye lift, but we didn't have them do it just then. We gave them some alerts in the planning session. You might feel tired after this treatment, perhaps even for a few days. Everyone's different. I think most people really don't have that, and it's probably because of that LCME, but I do mention it just in case. We ask them to keep track of dreams, memories, catharsis, unusual experiences maybe they have, insights into themselves. There's actually a whole host of things as symptoms. I forgot to write that. That's important. And we really, really insist and ask them to please keep track. To keep track of that, because it's super informative for the debrief session. Okay, let's talk a little bit about anger, in case any of you are like, well, I don't want my client living in anger, and we move away from anger, and what about forgiveness? And I believe all those things. But if it's still impacting their life, then perhaps there's reason to address, perhaps they are suppressing it. If your client, we'll talk about in terms of the experiment, if clients said, oh no, I'm mad at my mom, right? And oh boy, do I hear that. Not personally. Well, that sounded terrible. No, I hear that literally. If they very quickly suddenly start saying, I am so irritated, I am so frustrated, aggravated, that's a super great hint that maybe they're not feeling angry. It's something milder, and that a little bit of work needs to be done in this area. Sometimes, as I said before, they'll insist that they're angry at this caregiver, but then in seconds they're cheerful. Or they'll turn it around on themselves. Oh, I'm so frustrated with myself. Why am I still doing these things? Like, it's just quickly moving from anger toward that focal person. There's a whole literal list that we gave our clinicians that were participating in the study, things that your clients are probably going to say. They put a roof over my head. They did the best they could. They had their own issues, all of which is probably true. But you can still be angry if it's impacting you still as a client. Sometimes the way to get past these resistant responses, these defense mechanisms, is to say, you know, your niece, I know it sounds horrible, but it does work. Your niece, so-and-so, Susie, what if what had happened to you happened to her? I have never had a client say anything except, oh yeah, I would be angry. I am angry, thinking about it. So that was really helpful to get past resistance, to do the treatment, to help them work toward neuroplasticity, changing their neural pathways. A question I like to ask is, hey, were you allowed to have your feelings? Because sometimes people will say, there really were no big traumas, then they'll proceed to tell you about a trauma. That happened. But even if there really were no big incidents that happened, were they allowed to have their feelings? And that can be a prompt as well. I fully acknowledge this is the most difficult part of the treatment because of resistance, because of defense mechanisms. And as I said before, a really important motivator for me is to help us differentiate just the normal emotion of anger from that kind of anger that's above the window of tolerance, and to help keep people from avoiding and suppressing in ways that are harmful to them, just so that they feel things organically. As I said, anger is a both and we look at the toll. If it's still taking a toll, maybe it's worth addressing. Treatment session, we reviewed the checklist that I just went over, made sure everything was still resonating. We reviewed eye lifts, how to do them. We had them do the eye lift. We had them rest their eyes, because it's a little tiring, to be honest. And then the questions that the therapists asked were, what emotions did you feel and where did you feel them? Briefly describe. We don't want them talking too much, because it sort of takes them out of the experience. Then, what thoughts did you have and how do you feel emotionally about those thoughts? If they're not big talkers, you can say what else our therapist could say, what else did you notice? If anger was accessed after, say, the first eye lift, we would have them go right into the somatic release and try to really deepen that emotion, the experience of that emotion. We repeated the eye lifts for a total of 4 to 6. If anger was never accessed, which does happen sometimes in the treatment at least, and we'll talk about that, we did the somatic release about halfway through and at the end. And then we reminded them of all those things they need to keep track of, and how really important it is, along with keeping track of symptoms. I will tell you, there have been clients who did not feel anger during the treatment, and then came back a week later and told me they had a dream about anger, or something like that. Really interesting. Thank you for smiling. So the debrief really needs to take place at least a few days after. So you don't want to be doing it the next day, because for some reason it seems what my clients have been reporting back to me is that this happens or that happens, but this happened on day 2 or day 3 or even day 4 or 5. So I do like to see it happen about a week later. We had them keep track, and we didn't say the word vivid, but like a bunch of people came back and said, my dreams were more vivid. I remembered them more than I usually do, which we can talk about. All those things I've listed, we've talked about previously. One additional one is something I just started calling automatic eye lifts, because some clients started coming back to me and saying, my eyes started going up by themselves. And I was like, oh, okay. So it's a really interesting phenomenon. Even if they did not seem relevant to the client, this is important. Sometimes clients will come in, and one of my clients said, well, I had a dream, but I don't think it really was anything. And I said, you guys need to be deciding that, right? We need to decide that. So I just said, why don't you tell me about it? And she said, well, I was painting a wall, and I was painting around some pictures. So I said, and she said, someone was watching me. And I said, well, can you tell me a little bit more? What were the pictures? I kind of knew what she was going to say. I don't know how, but she said they were photographs. I knew she didn't mean like a Monet. right? So they were photographs, and she said, you know, with the big white edges? And I said, oh, older photographs, like older people like me remember. And she's like, yes, from my they were pictures from my childhood. Oh, okay. You know, I didn't do that to her, but I did. I roll, exactly. So it's up to the clinician to decide. And then I did ask her, I was like, I'm just going to ask her, so who's watching you paint around these photographs from your childhood? I think it's my mom. Oh my gosh, it was great. So that kind of thing happened a lot. I had a client who didn't feel anger during the treatment at all. She had a pretty significant case of has still. We're working through it. OCD, pretty significant, a lot of severe abuse. And every single type of abuse you can name, she has had. So she didn't have anger during the treatment, but she came back and said, well, I had a dream about my ex. This is a man who shoved her head in the toilet while raping her. And literally, and she dreamt about him, and she said, he was driving my car, and I was in the back seat. And I was screaming at him, why are you driving my car? And it was amazing. And her new boyfriend was in the passenger seat. It was just super cool. So I thought I'd share that. I thought those were good examples. I have a lot of them. And of course, we want them to keep track of symptoms, and we review that in the debrief session. Okay, let's look at the pilot study. So this study was exploratory in nature because it was small. We didn't have a ton of money the first time. This was through the University of Wisconsin Whitewater, and we didn't have any other studies to look at. So this was just exploratory. We were just going to see what we were going to see. We used the Beck Depression Inventory 2. For some reason, we called it BDI instead of BDI-2 throughout. And we did see a significant reduction, which I'll go into, of depressive symptoms. Again, remember, we were just looking at depression. We weren't looking at other things. With the new study, with the grants we just got, we're looking at other things. We also used the PANIS, Positive and Negative Affect Schedule. The way that works is there are certain words that are measured with a Likert scale, and some are in the positive, and I hate to say negative, but some are in the negative, I guess. And if you come out near 0, you kind of are equaling out, right? You're not more unhappy than you are happy, or vice versa. But if you're a positive number, you're feeling positive. If you're a negative number, you're feeling not so great. And we saw significant stabilization of mood and emotion regulation. States of calm, relief, release emotionally, deeper insights, and this was just 2 treatments. So we did planning, treatment, debrief, planning, treatment, debrief. That's how release is done as well, when it's done in reality. So let's look at some of these descriptives. I'll be quick. Okay, so the PANIS, that scale that I was talking about, just looking at the female, and you can see how small the study was. We actually had 16 people, 2 fell out because it's called atrophy. They didn't fill out the forms correctly. And we're not supposed to look at the forms because that would compromise the study. So we didn't know it until the end. But we had 12 females and 2 males. Not great, but that's what we had. And let's look here. So before they did the treatment, the females were kind of equaling out at 0. After those 2 treatments, they were all the way up in positive territory at 17.92. Looking at those 2 males, they were doing more poorly at the beginning before the treatments. They were at minus 9.5. After the 2 treatments, they came up a good amount to just barely in positive territory, plus 0.5. And we'll talk about that. So, sure.
I'm curious, with the PANIS, do males tend to, on average, in just a normative population, score lower?
She's nodding, but I actually do not know the answer to that question. I can find out for you if you want to. Oh, Melissa can give your name, and I'd love to find that out. That's a great question. Because, I mean, when you're talking about 2, it's kind of hard to say that that's a generalization, that we can generalize that way. But I think that's a great question. Thanks, Melissa. Did you have another?
No.
Okay. Okay. So,
what you said, just barely to the positive 0.5, and then it goes from 0.5 to 26.
no, that's the mean.
Oh, okay.
And that's the BDI. Oh, you know what? I didn't talk about the BDI. Well, thank you.
No.
Yeah, so we went with the PANIS, the two gentlemen in the study went from negative 9.5 up to just into the positive territory of 0.5. I didn't even cover the Beck depression inventory too. So let's go back up and look at the females. The females, now this time when you see a high number, that means the person's depressed, right? We want the number to be lower with the BDI. So this is a little bit of a different type of a scale. The females started out, let me use the pointer, this is complicated, at 21. And they dropped, after the 2 treatments, to 5.67. Pretty big drop. The 2 males started out at 26, so they were more depressed than the females, again, and oops, they dropped to 17.5. We did not see as big a change with the 2 males. So we can acknowledge that. We'll also look at the group as a whole. I'm so glad you asked that question because I left out part. Yes?
Is it more about the self-reporting maybe with men? You know?
Oh, what an excellent observation. Can you jot that down, Melissa? Thank you. It's a great observation, potentially. Right? Yeah.
Well, the BDI score of 21 or 26 is significantly like severe depression. And if you go to like a 5 or 6 or even 17, it's just a lot lower rate in regards to the clinical nature of it. So it's still very significant.
Yes. Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate you. Helpful. Okay, let's see if I can see what I'm even looking at here. So, looking across at the females. And again, you see how we didn't have diversity at all, and we talk about that in our limitations. I have a slide on limitations. It's a significant limitation, which we're very much hoping to address in the next study. We have to, really. So looking just at the females, 9 had a decrease of emotion dysregulation, 1 increased, 2 had no change. The males, again, sort of interesting, 1 decreased, 1 no change. Looking at the PANIS, I really should have, these are hard to see. Looking at the whole group, that's what we did. I should have separated this out to a different slide. Looking at the whole group, now we're looking at males and females together, and we'll look at the PANIS. As a whole group, they started out before the treatment at minus 1.37, so a little bit in negative territory, and went all the way up to 15.429 after the 2 treatments. So grateful to have you guys here asking these questions. Thank you. So this is just a graphical representation of what we've been talking about, specifically what I just said, the PANIS. I honestly cannot tell you. I've been asking. We had a gentleman named Corey Fritsch who digested all these numbers for us and generated this. I don't know why they put the pretest to the right, but they do. So this is where they were at the beginning of the treatment, and this is the PANIS. So they're hovering around 0 or flat, and they went all the way up into this territory where we're getting closer into the upper teens. So that's just meant to be a graphical representation of the numbers we just discussed. Yeah. Okay, so for the whole group, females and males, not separating them out, before the treatment, the average was 21.714. And after the 2 treatments as a group, it dropped to 7.357. Below that is that graphical representation. Again, the pretest is over here. And let's remember, like I said, when we're talking about the BDI-2, a higher number just means more clinical symptoms of depression. So they were pretty high up here and dropped pretty well over there after the treatment.
I wonder if you looked at some of those individual scores on the BDI, like the suicidality or something, if maybe that would be something discriminatory that you more
can you get that?
discrimination.
Thank you.
I'm
Thank
not
you.
using the word like
No, it's a great way to dissect the information a little bit differently. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, so if you look at individual questions on there,
Yes.
which ones are more elevated maybe, and that might give you a better indication of were some more risk factors removed as a result after the treatment, which would make your results look
Better. Yeah. Can we get her name?
Yes.
Awesome, thank you. Awesome. Okay. Can I do this? Yes. Okay, let's talk about effect size. Because when you have such a small study, you're not really going to be able to generalize a whole lot, right? Especially when it wasn't representative of our population. So the PANAS score, it is statistically significant. I'm not going to be the expert on this. Gina Martin, who wasn't able to be here, would have been the expert on this. She's the professor who works at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater and was our PI for this study. It was different at different points in time. That's just the before and after. But when they calculated that what they call the generalized ETA score, they got a 0.64. What that means is 64% of the variance between the scores before the treatment and after the treatment can be explained by the treatment. So when we were, I know it was really impressive and exciting. When we did the same for the BDI, we got a generalized ETA squared of 0.6, so 60% of the variance in pre and post-test scores can be explained by the treatment. And anything over 0.14 or 14% is considered a large effect size. So it does show us a lot of hope for these eye movements. And a reason that the literature says, hey, let's study, the LCN system. And then I connected the eye lift to what I was reading about the LCN and made this deduction. So looking at the qual part, because we did both quant and qual, we saw increased emotional accessing, processing. We saw increased access to memories and insights into themselves. We saw an increased occurrence of dreams, recall of dreams, vividness of dreams, and improved mood and emotion regulation. Here are some of the quotes. Are we good on time?
Yeah,
okay.
doing great.
I was able to relieve a lot of stored up pain and anger, and now find myself naturally practicing methods used during release in moments of stress. Gives more detail to memories that are fuzzy and seem locked away. I pulled one quote from each of those 4 things. So emotion accessing, memory accessing and insights, dreams, and mood. So each of these sort of speaks to that. I would have dreams and felt more relaxed in the days that followed treatment. We saw the word vivid over and over again. Also a positive shift in mood and an increase in my confidence to handle symptoms arising. Again, we had some limitations and they were significant. The N was just way too small. So we're going to try to have a much larger study with this new grant rate. That equalizes no statistical power, no ability to generalize to the population, of course. We had a total lack of diversity, and we did not consider for psychotropic medications. So that variable isn't accounted for. So an update on release. Okay, our next study. What time is it? Just
You have
oh, okay, perfect.
17 minutes.
Thank you. You were all ready to go with your next study. Okay, our next study, we went from a single university study, UW-Whitewater, to now a multi-university study throughout the entire UW system, which is very gratifying and encouraging. Right now, we also received the first we got is the IGNITE grant. We also got something called the SPARK grant, which is meant to help the state of Wisconsin. That's what that money is for. They have some significant mental health issues there, as the country does as a whole, but it's pretty significant there. As I said, we got 12 times as much money based on the results of the first study. We have 6 universities already signed up, and a 7th that's just awaiting some kind of approval. I forget exactly what. We will be measuring this time for PTSD and trauma using 2 measures. We'll be looking again at depression, anxiety, emotion regulation, and quality of life.
What are the 2 measures?
I don't know. I could text her.
What was the question?
What are the 2 measures of PTSD and trauma, but you don't have Gina's phone number? I'm sorry. I can get your
Do you know
email.
if one of them's a defined?
I don't think so. I don't think that's what she told me. I apologize. I didn't get that right. Sorry. Okay, if you are interested, and I know we have some researchers here today, if you'd like, we are in discussions with a professor at Northwestern, it's not the professor I mentioned earlier, to potentially do a multi-university study. So you can reach out to me. I have business cards, oh, I think I forgot to get them out, but I have them in my purse, we'll get those out. You can reach out to me, and we can see if we can set that up. You are, of course, welcome to study it on your own at your university or in your own practice if you'd like to do that. And if you are a Wisconsin clinician, you can join the study that is about to start. We're actually awaiting IRB approval. Gina is finishing the IRB application, and then we should get it because it pretty much replicates the first one that they already previously. Oh, and then if you have any interest in learning release itself, we are doing a basic training that covers the iLab systematic release, what we've been talking about today, and this whole other component that does not involve the eyes at all. But I will tell you, in my opinion, it is more novel than what we have been talking about. It mimics the inside of the window of tolerance, and there's reasons why I'm not going to talk about it right now, but it is covered in this training, which takes place in November, and includes 18 CEUs, good in all 50 states, but only for counselors and social workers, so no psychologists at this time, but we're working on that. And let's see, there's my contact info, and that's where you would sign up if you want to do the training. There is a cost to do the training, so you would have to look at that. I can't even remember. I think 400 and something is the early bird price. And that's my contact info if you would like to reach out to me for any reason whatsoever. And that's, yeah.
Where's the training?
Yeah, we're,
Oh, it's strictly through Zoom, and it's 3 days long, 9 a.m. Central to 4 p.m. Central, and whatever the variation that is for that on Eastern Mountain Pacific. But it's 9 to 4 Central. What's up?
Did you mention the 18 CEUs?
I did, I think, 18 CEs for this training, good in every state, for counselors and also social workers. Here. Any questions? We'll use the remaining time for questions. I'll do the best I can without Gina Martin here. Yes?
Were you also being trained in EMDR?
Yes.
You know when you get stuck on a lateral eye movement and then suggest going diagonal or up and down?
Yeah.
Anecdotally, do you feel like this is related in that way?
Oh, I can't speak for them, of course. I would be careful. There are a couple, I hope that's not.
yeah, I think it is. I'm sorry, I can't.
I thought
Do
you
you want me
turned it
just to,
on. You know what, I turned it on. I apologize. So,
I didn't help you, sorry.
no, you're fine. There are other treatments that do use an upper arm or a circular eye movement, or something called, oh gosh, am I going to remember it? What is it called? DNRS. Has anybody ever heard of that? They use like circular eye movements. It's about reprogramming the brain. I'm not an expert on it. And there's also something called eye movement integration, or EMI, which is pretty globally used. And they use all kinds of different eye movements. I would hazard a guess that it's absolutely working for these reasons that we've covered. Why would it not? Yeah. And they do it pretty quickly. Is that what they do in EMDR?
Yeah,
Okay.
instead of a hold, it's
Up and down.
still
Okay.
fast, but
Okay.
diagonal.
Diagonal. I thought it was diagonal as well. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Any other questions that I can attempt to answer? Hi.
Hi. So I especially been working with military veterans and first responders who have a lot of head injuries.
Yeah.
And I'm EMDR trained, so I'm familiar with them.
You use.
Have the tapping or some sort of buzzing or whatever. Would this elicit that same possibility of like dizziness and vertigo?
I have not had that happen so far in people with traumatic brain injuries. However, one of the adjustments we could make is to use the part that I did lecture on today, which is wholly palming. It's meant, as I said, to mimic that center of the middle of the window of tolerance. Any other questions?
Just a comment, I know you guys said you're gonna look at the diversity piece.
Yes.
Because, I mean, I'm from the African American point of view, I'm even Caribbean, the way that, you know, especially women, they move their eyes in a different cultural sense. So, I mean, just researching more on that.
Thank you.
So when you do persons from other from the white population, yeah.
Okay, so it has
Looking at that.
a cultural significance.
Yes, it does.
That's
It really
different.
does. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
yes.
it does. It does, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's agreeing. Okay. I guess I do need to know about that.
Yeah, it does.
Apologies. Any other comments or questions? Sure.
When Andrew Huberman came to Seattle,
Oh.
he spoke to a general audience and taught gaze dilation, which I guess is panoramic
Yes.
vision. And I've been sharing it with clients,
Yes.
and they like it a lot.
Yes, isn't it fabulous? I would say a lot of my clients say it's their favorite thing. And there are, like I said, there are many exercises within release. That's one of them. It's not proprietary to us. It's not proprietary to him either, but it is fantastic. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, it's really calming. And we could do it together if you want. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your attention.
There are signups. If you would like a copy of the PowerPoint presentation or be on the email address, there are signups on the tables, or you can see me.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Down first.